Hello guys. In this part, I want to talk about the blood pressure and the factors which can affect our blood pressure. The blood pressure is the force per unit area which the blood can exert against the inside wall of the blood vessel. And the blood pressure gradient is the change in blood pressure from one end of a blood vessel to the other end of the blood vessel. And this blood pressure gradient is the force which can propel the blood through the blood vessel. This pressure gradient is highest in the arteries, specifically the arteries which are near to our heart, and it's lowest in the veins. We have a term which we call it the arterial blood pressure. You need to know that the blood flow in our arteries have pulse, and most of you can palpate your pulse when you put your two fingers on, and you can see your blood vessel start to throbbing. This is your pulse. And the pulse is the result of contraction and relaxation of the ventricles. We have two types of pressure. One type of pressure in our blood vessel is called systolic pressure or systolic blood pressure. This systolic blood pressure occurs when our ventricles are in contraction or systole. This is the highest pressure which is generated in the arteries. At this time, the arteries become stretched and they hold a large amount of blood. I will talk about this part later for you. And the other pressure which we have is called diastolic blood pressure. The diastolic blood pressure occurs when our ventricles are in relaxation mode or a diastole mode. And this is the lowest pressure which is generated in our arteries. And this is the result of recoiling our arteries. I talked about this recoiling before for you. I told you that in the wall of our arteries, we have internal and external elastic membrane. And also in the large arteries, we have elastic plate in tunica media. When all of these elastic fibers become stretched during the cardiac systole, when they propel the blood, they should return back to their original shape, and we call it recoiling. And this recoiling can make the lowest blood pressure. When we want to talk about the blood pressure, we have a ratio here. You can see this ratio in this part. In a normal adult, the blood pressure is 120/80. The upper number can show us the systolic blood pressure, and the lower number can show us the diastolic blood pressure. So in a normal person, we have the blood pressure 120/80. 120 is systolic and 80 is diastolic blood pressure. We have a term which we call it pulse pressure. The pulse pressure is the additional pressure placed on the arteries from when the heart is resting to when the heart is contracting. The pulse pressure is the difference between systolic and diastolic blood pressure. So, if our blood pressure is 120/80, our pulse pressure is the difference of these two numbers. So, let me type it here for you. We have 120 minus 80, it's equal to 40, and 40 is our pulse pressure. So this is a pressure, the additional pressure which comes to the wall of our arteries. And the pulse pressure can reflect the elasticity of our blood vessels. It means that if our blood vessels can show elasticity, they become stretched and then they recoil back to their original shape, they have a good and normal pulse pressure. If the pulse pressure change, if the pulse pressure decrease, it means that our blood vessels cannot go to contraction and relaxation easily. So the pulse pressure allows for palpating of a throbbing pulse in the elastic and muscular arteries. The pulse is a throbbing of arterial wall. It allows us to determine the heartbeat rate. The number of our heart rate is equal to the number of our pulse rate. So if you put your two fingers on your wrist and count the number of your pulse in 1 minute, it's equal to your heart rate. The pulse is more forceful when the blood pressure is higher, and it becomes slower when your blood pressure comes down. So it's the absence of our pulse rate indicates that we have problem for flow of blood in the specific part of our body. And we have some parts in our body which can palpate our pulse better than the others. When our artery is compressed against a solid structure like our bone or the cartilage, we can sense the pulse better. And here you can see the name of the arteries which you can sense the pulse: radial, common carotid, femoral, dorsalis pedis, and for example popliteal or posterior tibial, and I will show you in the next picture. Look at this picture. In this picture, you can see the site of pulse. Here we have a superficial temporal artery. It's located on our temporal bone. This is a facial artery on our mandible. Here you can see the common carotid artery in the cervical region or neck. Here you have the brachial artery in the brachial part or on your humerus. In this part, you have radial artery in your wrist. We have femoral artery in the groin region. In the back of the knee, you can palpate popliteal artery. In the back of your ankle, you can have the posterior tibial artery pulse. And on the dorsal surface of your feet, you have dorsalis pedis arteries. In these arteries, because they run on the surface of the bone, you can sense the pulse better than the other part of your body. And in this picture, you can see the pulse pressure. I will talk about how we can measure the blood pressure in the last slide of this chapter, this part for you. But imagine that we measure the blood pressure and we have systolic and diastolic number. The systolic blood pressure is 120 in normal person, and this 120 shows us the stretching which we have in our arteries. And the diastolic blood pressure is 80, and this is the time when our blood vessels or the arteries go to recoiling or go to contraction here, as you see in this picture. And the difference between systolic pressure and diastolic pressure is called pulse pressure, and the pulse pressure can reflect the elasticity which we have in our blood vessels. In this picture, you can see the pulse pressure, the blood pressure in different parts of our body. The blood pressure is highest in the aorta. The aorta is the largest artery, and this is the artery full of elastic fibers. So the blood pressure is higher in this part. This artery is very near to our heart. So the contraction of our ventricle immediately can transfer to the wall of aorta, and it can show the highest blood pressure. When we come to medium-sized arteries, the blood pressure is still high, but it's lower than our aorta. And when we come to the arterial, as you see in this picture, the blood pressure decrease. Then in the site of capillary, the blood pressure decrease again. And when we come to the venal vein and the vena cava, as you see in this picture, the blood pressure become low and low, and in the vena cava it reached near zero. So the blood pressure is highest in the arteries, specifically large artery, and when we come down, you see that the blood pressure decrease, and in the veins, actually we don't have any blood pressure. During the day, we have a fluctuation in the blood pressure. Sometimes we are excited, our blood pressure is higher. Sometimes we're doing workout, our blood pressure is higher. And sometimes we take nap, we are resting, we are sitting and watching TV, and our blood pressure come down. And we need to have a mean arterial blood pressure. We need to have the average of the arterial blood pressure in our body during the day. For having the mean arterial blood pressure, we need to have the diastolic blood pressure and our pulse pressure. And we have the equation for this mean arterial blood pressure. The mean arterial blood pressure is equal to diastolic blood pressure plus 1/3 of pulse pressure. Imagine that your blood pressure is 120/80. First, you need to calculate your pulse pressure. Your pulse pressure is equal to systolic blood pressure minus diastolic blood pressure. 120 minus 80 is equal to 40. And don't forget to write the units. The unit of the pulse pressure is millimeter of mercury. And after that, when you have your pulse pressure, you can easily calculate your mean arterial pressure. 80, which is the diastolic blood pressure, plus 1/3 of pulse pressure, 1/3 of 40, and it's equal to 93. And again, the unit of your mean blood pressure is millimeter of mercury too. The unit is like your pulse pressure. And the mean arterial blood pressure is clinically significant because it can provide a numeric value for how well our body tissues and organs are perfused. It can provide the index of perfusion. If the mean arterial blood pressure is less than 60, it can show us we don't have enough blood flow in different parts of our body. And if the mean arterial pressure is more than 110, it shows us we have large amount of blood in one part of our body, and it causes swelling and edema at that part. So the normal range of our mean arterial pressure should be between 60 to 110. And in the example which we have here, we have 93, and it's completely normal. And you see that the diastolic blood pressure has greater effect on our mean arterial pressure, because the time when our heart is in diastolic or resting mode is longer than systolic. So the diastolic blood pressure can have more effect on the arterial blood pressure. Now, I want to talk about the venous blood pressure and the venous return. The movement of blood from the capillaries back to the heart happens through the veins, and we call it venous return. And as I showed you in the graph before, the blood pressure in the venules and in the vein first doesn't have any pulse, and then it's very, very low. And this pressure cannot bring the blood back to our heart. The blood pressure is about 20 millimeter of mercury in the venule, and it's about 0 in the vena cava, superior and inferior vena cava. So this pressure is very low, and we need some help for our veins to return the blood back to the heart. One reason for the lowest pressure in the vein is that if you remember from the structure of the blood vessels, the tunica media is very thin in the veins, so we don't have enough muscle to go to contraction and relaxation and make pressure on the blood. So we need some help. One of the help which we have here is called skeletal muscle pump. One of them is called respiratory pump, and the other help which is very important, and I forgot to type it here for you, is the venous valve. The valve of the veins are very important to help the blood to go up and go to our heart. First, I want to talk about the skeletal muscle pump. Look at this picture. In this picture, you can see the skeletal muscle pump. The skeletal muscle pump can help the movement of blood, specifically in the limbs, lower limbs. As a skeletal muscle go to contraction, they can make pressure on the veins and help the blood to go up. And the valves, which you can see here, prevent backflow of the blood in these limbs. When a skeletal muscle are more active, for example, when we are walking, when we are jogging, when we are running, the blood is circulated more quickly and efficiently toward the heart by the skeletal muscle pump. And conversely, when we are inactive, then we have blood pooling in our lower limb, and it increases the risk of thrombosis which happen in our lower limb. So the skeletal muscle pump and the valves which you can see here is one way, one help which can move blood toward our heart. The other help for the venous return is called a respiratory pump. The respiratory pump can help the blood move in our abdomen and also in our thoracic cavity. I will talk about this slide on the picture. Look at here. In this picture, you can see the respiratory pump. First, I want to talk about the inspiration or inhalation. As you see in this picture, at the time of inhalation, our diaphragm go to contraction and come down. When it comes down, it can make pressure on the abdominal cavity and abdominal viscera. So the organs which we have in our abdomen can make pressure on the veins go to compression, and the blood can come up. At the same time, because the diaphragm come down, our thoracic cavity increase in its size and the pressure in our thoracic cavity decrease. And you know that all the times the blood like to move from the place where the pressure is higher to the place where the pressure is lower. So the blood come up and it can easily go to our heart through this inferior vena cava. And what happened during expiration? When we are doing expiration, as you see here, the diaphragm goes up. First, we have relaxation of abdominal wall and the release of we have release of compression on the inferior vena cava. The cavity of our thoracic cage decrease, the pressure here increase, and this increased pressure help the blood to go to our heart. And this is the meaning of venous return. So you see that at the time of respiration, at the time of inspiration and expiration, we can move blood in our veins. So the skeletal muscle pump and also the respiratory pump and the help of the valve can help the blood to move in our veins, because our veins doesn't have enough muscles in their wall to help the blood to move through them. And when we have clot in the veins, we call it thrombosis. And we have a problem which we call it DVT or deep vein thrombosis. It happens commonly in the muscle of calf or in the sural region. The heart disease, immobility, and some risk factor can increase the happening of thrombosis. And you know that the thrombosis is clot of blood or deposition of some fats or cholesterol in the wall of the blood vessels, which detach from the blood vessel wall by flow of blood. And it can make fever, tenderness, and redness of the part which is affected. We have pain and swelling of the area, and the heartbeat increase. And then this thrombosis can easily go to our lungs, and it can make pulmonary embolus. And when we have pulmonary embolus, it can make many problems by respiration and also heart problems. And I talked about varicose vein before for you. When our veins become dilated and tertious, and this is the result of non-functional valves, and it can make blood pool in the lower limb of our body. It's most common in superficial vein of our lower limbs, and the genetics, aging, and extended standing, obesity, and pregnancy can make varicose vein. And sometimes this varicose vein happen in the anal region, and we call it hemorrhoids. And it's due to the increase in abdominal pressure, specifically at the time of pregnancy. The blood pressure gradient in the systemic circulation. Now, you know that the normal range of blood pressure values in various portions of our vasculature. We can use the average blood pressure in the arteries close to the heart and the blood pressure in inferior vena cava to calculate the total blood pressure gradient in our systemic circulation. And I told you that when our blood pressure is 120/80, our mean arterial blood pressure become 93 millimeter of mercury in our arteries. And at that time, in the vena cava, this blood pressure is 0. This difference which we have between the arterial blood pressure and the venous blood pressure can make a force which can help the blood to move in our circulatory system. So when the gradient increase, the flow of blood increase too. So because the blood like to move from the place where the pressure is higher to the place where the pressure is lower. So from the aorta, it goes to a medium-sized artery, a small artery, arterial, and then capillary, venal, a small size vein, and then large vein like inferior and superior vena cava. And this is the circulation of the blood in our body. And this gradient increase by cardiac output. When our cardiac output goes up, this gradient increase and the blood can move faster and faster. The other thing which you need to know about the blood pressure is the resistance. The resistance can influence our blood flow. The resistance is defined as the amount of friction the blood experiences as it's transported through the blood vessels. The blood flow is always opposed to resistance. This friction is due to the contact between the blood and the blood vessel wall. And we have a term which we call it peripheral resistance. The peripheral resistance is when the happen when the resistance of blood, when we have resistance of blood in our blood vessels in all parts of our body. And the peripheral resistance affected by viscosity of our blood, the blood vessel length, and the lumen size of our blood vessels. First, the blood viscosity. Viscosity refers to the resistance of a flow fluid to its flow. And it is the thickness of a fluid. The thicker the fluid, the more viscous it is, and the greater its resistance to flow. The thickness is dependent on the percentage of the particle in the fluid. And you know that our blood is about 5 times thicker than water. In our blood, we have formed elements, we have proteins, we have many nutrient, waste product, gases, and due to all of these components and content, the viscosity of our blood is higher than the viscosity of water. The viscosity decreases when we have anemia. When the amount of red blood cells come down, the viscosity of our blood decreases. And the viscosity increase when we have blood doping. When we use doping drugs, when we become dehydrated, at that time, the number of our red blood cells increase and the viscosity of our blood increase. So when our blood become more viscous, it's harder for the blood to move in the blood vessels and our blood pressure come down. And when our blood become less viscous, it can move easily in our blood vessels. And I hope you remember that in the lab I talked about anemia and polycythemia. Both of them are abnormal condition and both of them can affect our blood pressure. The other factor is the vessel length. Increasing vessel length can increase the resistance because longer blood vessel result in greater friction and greater friction can make more resistance. In contrast, shorter blood vessel offer resistance than longer vessel when we compare their diameter together. Normally, blood vessel lengths remain constant in our body. But when we gain a large amount of weight, specifically fat, the body must produce miles of additional vessel length by angiogenesis for the blood to be transferred to the extra fat. Thus, the blood vessel resistance increases when we gain weight and weight and decrease we lose a lot of weight. And it's interesting to know that the total blood vessel length increase about 400 miles for each 2.2 pounds weight gain. It's very interesting. Because of that, the obese person has hypertension because they have longer blood vessels and the blood should move faster in their body. So the resistance increase and the blood pressure goes up. And the other factor is the vessel radius or the diameter of our blood vessel. A smaller radius creates more resistance. You know that the blood has a laminar flow, like the flow of water in river. You know that in the river, the water which are in the peripheral part can move slower, and the water which is in the center of a river can move faster. And we have the same situation in our blood vessel, flow fast in the center of blood vessel and slower near the blood vessel wall. And this because the blood vessel wall can make resistance. So when the diameter of our blood vessel increase, the resistance decrease and the flow increase. And less blood flowing along the blood vessel wall when we have dilation. So by vasodilation, the flow of blood increase. And you know that our body can change the diameter and the radius of the blood vessels. The arterial radius usually regulate the resistance. Vasodilation and vasoconstriction can be controlled by sympathetic part of our autonomic nervous system. And it can make a big change in total resistance. from a smaller diameter changes, and the resistance increase when we have atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis means when the blood vessel radius decrease. Sometimes we have problem in the endothelium, sometimes we have deposition of fat, and all of them can decrease the diameter of our blood vessel and increase the resistance. I hope you remember the picture which I drew for you before. If this is our blood vessel, when we have atherosclerosis, one part of our blood vessel become narrower, and when it become narrower, the pressure of blood in this part should increase because the resistance increase in this part. And the systemic blood pressure and resistance are related to each other. Clinical condition leading to sustained increased resistance can elevate the blood pressure. You see that at the time of obesity, at the time of atherosclerosis, our blood pressure increase. And it requires our heart to work harder to overcome this higher resistance, so the heart can beat faster and stronger. In this part, you need to answer this question: how does blood pressure differ between arteries, capillaries, and veins? What should be the pulse pressure and mean arterial pressure in someone with the blood pressure of 120/90 millimeter of mercury? What mechanism can help pump blood through our veins? And what effect does a vasoconstriction have on our resistance? What effect does this have on our blood flow? Now, I want to talk about the regulation of our blood pressure and regulation of our blood flow. The blood pressure must be high enough to propel blood through the cardiovascular system to maintain adequate perfusion in all tissue of our body. Yet not so high that it causes damage to the blood vessel wall, and not so slow to not deliver blood in all parts of our body. And the pressure depends on cardiac output, resistance, and the blood volume. And we have two important systems in our body which can control this blood pressure. One of them is the nervous system, and the other one is our endocrine system. The autonomic nervous system can do regulation of our blood pressure in short terms, and it involves nuclei which we have in our medulla oblongata. I hope you remember, in medulla we have cardiovascular center, and it can quickly adjust the cardiac output, resistance, and both of them. And then it can meet the need of our body for changing this blood pressure, specifically, for example, when we stand up immediately in the morning. The cardiovascular center is located in medulla, and it contains two autonomic nuclei. One of them is called cardiac center, and the other one is called vasomotor center. The cardiac center works with the function of our heart by changing the cardiac output, and the vasomotor center can work on the diameter of our blood vessel, make vasoconstriction or vasodilation. The cardiac center has two nuclei. One nuclei is called cardioacceleratory center, and it's the origin of sympathetic pathway, and it can send its impulses and its path to our sinoatrial node and the myocardium of the heart. And by activation of cardioacceleratory center, we have increase in the heart rate and force of contraction. So pay attention. When our cardioacceleratory center becomes stimulated, both our heart rate and force of contraction increase. So we have increase in cardiac output and blood pressure. The cardioinhibitory center is the origin of parasympathetic pathway. It extends to SA node and AV node, and the activity of this part can decrease our heart rate and slow conduction of electrical signals. But it doesn't work on the force of contraction of our heart. It can decrease our cardiac output and our blood pressure. And the other center is called Vasomotor Center. The Vasomotor Center is the origin of sympathetic pathway, and this pathway extends from the medulla oblongata to our blood vessels, and at that part they can release norepinephrine. And this norepinephrine and epinephrine, with the help of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla, can work on the diameter of our blood vessel. In our cardiovascular center, we have some receptors. I talked about these receptors before for you. We have some baroreceptors and we have some chemoreceptors. Baroreceptors are the receptors which can detect the pressure and the stretch which we have in the wall of our blood vessels. And the chemoreceptors are the receptors which can monitor the chemical composition of our blood. Now, I want to talk about these baroreceptors and chemoreceptors on this picture. In this picture, let me make it larger for you. You can see these baroreceptors and chemoreceptors. One of these baroreceptors is located in the aortic arch. We call it aortic arch baroreceptors. They are located in the tunica adventitia or tunica externa of the aortic arch, and also the carotid sinuses in the bifurcation of our carotid arteries. The aortic arch baroreceptors can transmit their signals to cardiovascular center through the vagus nerve. And the carotid sinuses can transmit their signals through nerve number 9, and I hope you remember the name of this nerve. This is the Golosa pharyngeal nerve. So they bring the information to our cardiovascular center. Sometimes our sympathetic pathway becomes stimulated, and sometimes our parasympathetic pathway becomes stimulated. If sympathetic pathway stimulates, you can see sympathetic by a green color. Look at here, the green color. This sympathetic pathway can come to our SA node, as you see here, AV node, and also the myocardium of the heart. And they increase the heart rate and power of contraction because it works on the myocardium. If parasympathetic pathway becomes stimulated, it comes to SA node and AV node. It doesn't go to myocardium, so it doesn't work on our contraction. It only works on generation of heartbeat, so it decreases our heart rate. And the sympathetic pathway can stimulate the blood vessels. Sometimes our blood vessel go to vasoconstriction, and sometimes the blood vessel go to vasodilation. By vasoconstriction and vasodilation, they can change the blood pressure. The autonomic reflexes for blood pressure are baroreceptor reflex. It's initiated by decrease or increase in the blood pressure. If the blood pressure decrease, the vessel stretch decline and the baroreceptor firing rate decrease. This activates the cardioacceleratory center to stimulate the sympathetic pathway, and this sympathetic pathway can increase our cardiac output. And then it inhibits the cardioinhibitory center to minimize the parasympathetic activity. We have activation of Vasomotor Center, which stimulates the sympathetic pathway to the blood vessel, and we have vasoconstriction. The increase in cardiac output and resistance can raise our blood pressure. And in the opposite situation, if our blood pressure increase, the vessel stretch and the baroreceptor firing rate increase. This causes the cardioacceleratory center to send less signals through the sympathetic pathway, so it stimulates the cardio inhibitory center to activate the parasympathetic pathway to SA node and AV node of the heart. And as you know, the number of our heart rate decrease. It causes the vasomotor center to send less signals by the sympathetic pathway to the blood vessel. So our cardiac output decrease, and we have decrease in the the resistance can decrease our blood pressure. The baroreceptor reflex are best for quick changes in the blood pressure, but are ineffective for long-term blood pressure regulation. And what is the chemoreceptor reflex? The chemoreceptor reflex can influence our blood pressure. A stimulation of chemoreceptors can bring about negative feedback reflex to return the blood chemistry to the normal. And the response is in both respiratory center and cardiovascular center. We have two types of chemoreceptors. One of them is located in the aortic arch, and one of them is located in the bifurcation of carotid arteries. We call them aortic bodies and carotid bodies. And you know that the aortic bodies can send their information via vagus nerve, and the carotid bodies can send their information through the glossopharyngeal nerve. And what chemicals can stimulate our chemoreceptors? When we have high level of carbon dioxide, when the pH of blood come down, and when we have low oxygen in our blood, all of them can stimulate our chemoreceptors. The chemoreceptor fire, and they increase the nerve signals along the sympathetic pathway to the blood vessel. They shift blood from the venous reservoir to increase the venous return. Do you remember the veins are the biggest reservoir of the blood? At this time, the veins go to vasoconstriction and send their blood to our heart and to the other part of our cardiovascular center. They raise the blood pressure and increase the blood flow, specifically in our lung, to exchange more oxygen and carbon dioxide. And it allows for increased respiratory gases exchange in our lung. When these gases exchange, when we have more oxygen, then the pH of our blood gradually go up and up. And our higher brain center can work on the blood pressure and the blood vessel diameter. The hypothalamus can increase the cardiac output and resistance, and you know that when our body temperature change, and also when we are in fight or flight situation, our hypothalamus can increase the cardiac output and the resistance. And also our limbic system. Your limbic system works with your emotion and memory. When you fall in love, when you are in a stress, when you recall some memories, you see that your blood pressure and your heart rate sometimes go up. And this is due to the effect of your limbic system on your blood pressure and your cardiac output. Besides our central nervous system, we have some hormones from our endocrine system which can regulate our blood pressure. The epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is released from our adrenal medulla, can work with our sympathetic nervous system. And the other hormones are listed here. We have angiotensin 2, I will talk about it, anti-diuretic hormone or ADH, aldosterone from our adrenal gland, and atrial natriuretic peptide from our heart can affect our blood pressure. They affect on the resistance, blood volume, or both of them. And now I want to talk about this hormonal regulation. We have a pathway, we have a system which we call it renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. And I want to talk about this mechanism on the pictures, not on this slide. Look at here. Let me make this larger. Okay. When our blood pressure decrease, we have, sorry, let me see. Okay. When our blood pressure decrease, the kidney receptors can detect the lower pressure, and they start to release the hormone. This hormone is called renin, and the renin release in our bloodstream. So the kidney receptor can detect the decrease in the blood pressure. They start to release renin in the urinary system. I will talk about it, which cell can release this renin in our kidneys. The renin come to our blood. In the blood, we have the enzyme from our liver. Sorry, we have a protein from our liver, which we call it angiotensinogen. This protein is a hormone, and the renin work as the enzyme on this angiotensinogen and change it in angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is inactive hormone. Angiotensin 1 can get the effect of one enzyme from our lung. This enzyme is called angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. ACE work on angiotensin 1 and change it to angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is the active hormone. All of these happen in the bloodstream. Angiotensin 2 has different effects. The first effect is this. It can make vasoconstriction. When our blood vessel go to vasoconstriction, when the diameter of our blood vessel decrease, the blood pressure goes up. So we have lower blood pressure in the beginning. By vasoconstriction, the blood pressure increase. The other effect of angiotensin 2 is working on the thirst center in our hypothalamus. Our hypothalamus detects that we are thirsty, we drink water, and by drinking water, the volume of our blood increase and our blood pressure goes up. The other part is happening is releasing ADH, or Anti-Duritic Hormone, from posterior pituitary gland. The posterior pituitary gland start to secrete ADH. ADH prevents making urine, or it can decrease the amount of urine. It retains water in our body. By retaining water, the amount of blood goes up and the blood pressure increases. And also, the angiotensin 2 can work on our adrenal medulla. By working on adrenal medulla, we have release of adrenal cortex. We have release of aldosterone, and by release of aldosterone, the amount of sodium ion and water which are reabsorbed in our kidneys increase, and the volume of our blood increase, and the blood pressure goes up. So you see that when our blood pressure decreases, we have release of renin from our kidney. The renin works as an enzyme on angiotensinogen of liver, change it to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 in the bloodstream can get the effect of ACE as the enzyme and change to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is the active hormone. It can make vasoconstriction, it can stimulate the thirst center, it can decrease urine formation by the effect of ADH and aldosterone. So we have more blood, more water in our body, so the blood pressure in all cases goes up. We call it renin angiotensin aldosterone system or mechanism. And all the information which you need are in your PowerPoint. The other hormone which works on our blood volume and blood pressure separately besides the renin-angiotensin system is the aldosterone. Aldosterone released from the adrenal cortex, and the release of this hormone triggered by several stimulation, and one of them is angiotensin 2. It increases absorption of sodium ion and water in our kidney and decrease the amount of urine. Look at here. Imagine that this is your kidney tubule. In our kidney, and here we have the blood vessel. This on aldosterone come and work on the cells in our kidney tubule. By working on this cell, the reabsorption of sodium ion increase. And I hope you remember that when we have increase of reabsorption of one ion by osmotic pressure, water should reabsorb after that. So water is reabsorbed. What happened here? The amount of blood increase and the amount of urine decrease. When the amount of blood increase, the blood pressure goes up. This is how the aldosterone can affect on our kidney tubules. The other hormone which works in this part is anti-diuretic hormone. The anti-diuretic hormone helps maintain and elevate the blood pressure. It released from the posterior pituitary gland and release triggered by nerve signals from hypothalamus, and it's stimulated by increased blood concentration of angiotensin 2. The effect of ADH is increased water absorption in our kidney, so less fluid loss and maintain the blood volume. It stimulates the thirst center to increase fluid intake. In large amount, it can cause vasoconstriction. And because of that, the other name of ADH is vasopressin, because it can work on our contraction of blood vessel. And all of them can increase the blood pressure. The other hormone is called atrial natriuretic peptide. The atrial natriuretic peptide can decrease the blood pressure. This hormone is released from the atria of the heart when the volume of blood which return back to our atria of the heart increase, and the wall of our atria go to stretching. It stimulates vasodilation. By vasodilation, it can decrease the resistance, and also it can increase the urine output and lower the blood volume. So it's important that all of these hormones work together to do the homeostasis of cardiac output, resistance, and the blood volume together. And negative feedback mechanism can control all of these secretions. In this slide and in the next slide, you can see the factors that can affect our blood pressure. One of these factors is the cardiac output, and I hope you remember that our cardiac output or CO is equal to our heart rate times our stroke volume. So when we have tachycardia, when our heart rate increase, our cardiac output increase and the blood pressure increase. And when we have bradycardia, when our heart rate decrease, our blood pressure decrease too. And also the stroke volume. When the stroke volume increase due to the force of contraction, our blood pressure increase. And when our cardiac output decrease to the less force of contraction, our blood pressure decrease. So the cardiac output can affect our blood pressure, and cardiac output gets its own effect by heart rate and the stroke volume. And also the resistance. I told you that the resistance, the peripheral resistance, is the opposition of our blood flow. And the blood vessel radius, the vessel length, and the blood viscosity can change our resistance. In this picture, you see that when the radius of our blood vessel decrease by vasoconstriction, the resistance increase and the blood pressure increase. And when we have vasodilation, the resistance decrease and the blood pressure decrease too. The vessel length. Longer blood vessel can increase the resistance and the blood pressure goes up. And I talked about it in obesity. And shorter blood vessel can decrease the resistance and it lowers the blood pressure. And the blood viscosity. When the blood viscosity increase, the resistance and the blood pressure increase. The blood cannot move easy. It cannot flow smoothly in our blood vessels. And when the blood viscosity decrease, the resistance decrease and the blood pressure decrease too. So these factors can affect our blood pressure. And the last factor is the blood volume. You know that fluid intake can increase the blood volume and the blood pressure, and the fluid output can decrease the blood volume and blood pressure. You can see that by food and drink we can intake water, and also we can make water in our body by the metabolic activity. When the activity of your mitochondria increase during metabolism, you can make more water. And we can lose water by exhale air, sweat, and transpiration, urine, and feces. And all of them can affect our blood pressure. And for measuring the blood pressure, we use a sphygmomanometer. And I will talk about this sphygmomanometer on this picture. Look at here. For measuring the blood pressure, we can wrap this rubber cuff around the arm, and the lower edge of the cuff should be in antecubital fossa here. And we start pumping this cuff. By pumping the cuff, the air comes inside, and the air can make pressure on the brachial artery, and the blood flow stops. Then we gradually release and inflate the cuff. Release this screw and inflate the cuff, and start listening to the sound of these pulse. The first sound which we hear is called systolic blood pressure, and we should check the number on our gauge. And this sound continues, dop, 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 and when this sound disappears, we can see the number on this gauge, and it shows us the diastolic blood pressure. And the difference between systolic and diastolic blood pressure can show us the pulse pressure. I will post the different steps to do and to measure the blood pressure for the lab for you later. And hypertension means when our blood pressure increase. When the systolic blood pressure is more than 140 and the diastolic blood pressure is more than 90 millimeter of mercury, we call it hypertension. This hypertension can damage the blood vessel wall. It can make atherosclerosis and it thicken the blood vessel wall. And it can make heart failure. And hypotension happen when our blood pressure is lower than normal. When the systolic blood pressure is lower than 90 and the diastolic is lower than 60 millimeter of mercury. In this problem, we have fatigue, dizziness, and fatigue. And we have a type of hypotension which we call it orthostatic hypotension, and it's a sudden drop in the blood pressure immediately when we stand, specifically in the morning. We have dizziness, lightheadedness, and fainting. And after that, our blood pressure very quickly do regulation. And in this part, you need to answer this question. What responses occur when blood pressure in the carotid arteries falls when someone stands up rapidly? How does aldosterone prevent a fall in the blood pressure? What effect does atrial natriuretic peptide have on the blood pressure? And what is the vasomotor center and where it is located? Let me know if you have any question in this part.